Hi, my name is Emma Vanderhayden, and today I'm going to be talking about what I've learned in the Frontiers in Latin America course. So, throughout the 6 weeks that I've been taking this course, I have learned so much that I didn't know about Latin America. I really had no knowledge going into this course about Latin America, really at all. I never really learned about it in my other classes, and it was just something I never really um, thought to click on when I read the news because I really didn't know about any of the background that was going on, and this course definitely helped me understand some of the background in Latin America so that I could further understand what's going on today. So, in the first half of the course, I think it was really focused on history. We focused on learning about the Spanish conquest, which then we learned about the consequences of Spanish conquest, which were the dependence problems that Latin America had and still has today. We also learned about the different Latin American countries' fights for independence, like the differences between Brazil's fight for independence versus Mexico's. We also learned about imperialism and how when Britain was getting really involved in Latin America, they went into the region for economic benefits and to increase their presence. And we also learned about the start of the United States' reign in Latin America throughout their manifest destiny and their anti-communism stance during the Cold War. So I really think the first half of the course really helped me build a base of knowledge so that in the second half of the course I could really use that knowledge to help me further understand the current events we learned about in the second half. So in the second half of the course, I think it was more focused on current issues like environmental problems, social justice, and global interference, like the US interference or Asia's interference or Europe's. So to start, I want to talk about the U.S. interference in Latin America. So, as more countries entered Latin America and started using their resources, like the United States, they became way more dependent on those resources. So, in Latin America, when they started working with the U.S., one of the first things they started to export was bananas. And so, as they started exporting bananas, they weren't really doing much of their own agriculture because they were so focused on that. They weren't really getting the profits from it, but the United States wanted them to work on that. And so they started getting really dependent on the U.S., bringing them imports of different agricultural products that they needed. So again, this is not only a consequence of the Spanish conquest, but it's also a consequence just of different regions coming into Latin America, making them rely on the countries more, and so then they can't really depend on themselves to have a stable economy. Also, we learned about how most Central American countries have high involvements with the United States. This is something that I really noticed when we were reading about the Central America within the U.S. orbit, I believe it was the article, or it was the part of the book. I was reading every different country and all of their, I was Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and everyone had at least one part about how the U.S. was involved. And most of it wasn't great. So you have the Panama Canal that the U.S. interfered in. Panama didn't really want that. And the U.S. also intervened in Nicaragua for the canal. That didn't work out. They also intervened in Nicaragua for the Sandinistas. Sandinistas were very anti-U.S. And then also the U.S. intervened to stop communism in Guatemala and just in more Latin American countries. This ultimately resulted in resentment towards the United States. We can also see this in Mexico with the U.S., with I believe it was James K. Polk and sorry, I forgot the other one's name, but he went into Texas and they were trying to take Mexican land, and that really forced a resentment on the U.S. from Mexico. Mexico was just really not happy that the U.S. Took that land, and they were a bit humiliated by it, and they didn't really want to work with the U.S. anymore. And we can definitely see that today with sort of like border wars and stuff like that. Mexico and U.S. don't really have a great relationship, and Mexico harbors a lot of resentment to the U.S. for that. So something else I also learned about with U.S. intervention was Mexico's the NAFTA implementation into Mexico and the setup of transnational corporations for cheap labor and to get out of legal obligations like unions and paying enough money. So if the U.S. wanted to get cheap labor, instead of just, going to somewhere in the U.S., they would go to Mexico instead, so they could get cheap labor and not really have to treat the workers as well as they'd have to treat workers in America because of all the labor laws we have. And then the next part I want to talk about is the exploitation I learned about. The exploitation I learned about in Latin America is probably the most shocking thing to me, probably the thing that I didn't know about the most. So to start off with exploitation, we learned about how it harms the environment and also how it harms indigenous lands. So those are the two most important things I saw exploitation harming. Mostly it would interfere with indigenous lands. Indigenous peoples wouldn't really want that because those lands were spiritual to them. Or it would just harm lands in general, make really bad environmental impacts, like affect the water, make more pollution, stuff like that. So start with the exploitation. The first part I think we started to learn about exploitation was about the rubber boom. And the rubber boom was very helpful for the Industrial Revolution, but it also led to a lot of deforestation in the Amazon for cutting down the trees to get the rubber. We also learned about farming for soya, and when farming for soya, you're not only destroying the land, but Americans and European countries were also stealing the land. The land wasn't really gotten ethically. They would say it was like part of the government, it was like emptied land, but it still belonged to someone, and the US or Europe would just come and steal it. And also farming for soya led to a lot of monopolies and led to a lot of national agricultural businesses to crumble because of that. And we also learned about the exploitation of cheap Mexican labor with no unions, like I mentioned, ghost unions. Ghost unions were used basically just to protect the employer. There was no way that employees were really at all protected by in the unions. And we also learned about how maquiladoras were polluting the air. And the documentary we watched about Maquiapolis really opened my eyes to the harm that those companies are really doing to the areas around them. So for the women in the documentary, a lot of them were experiencing rashes or illness because they were exposed to that. Even one woman, I think, her doctor said she was at risk for getting leukemia because she was exposed to the chemicals. Even the water, if you didn't even work in the plants, the water would come down and it would be in the area which people lived. So it was all just really harmful for anyone living around those areas or working around those chemicals. I also learned about how people farm for minerals in the Andes, and this not only damages land, but a lot of places in the Andes are very symbolic for indigenous groups because the Andes had a really big Inca population. So a lot of anti-mining women started to protest against this. They did a lot of big things, like they would hold protests, hold community organizations, stuff like that. But then also what I learned is that a lot of small acts are what make the most impact in these regions. So a lot of the women would just not accept bribes because money was a really big thing that these companies would try to bribe people with, like, oh, you're gonna get money in the future, it'll be fine. But the women were really just they said no to further protect those indigenous lands and also just protect their environment. And something else I learned about different activists that try to work towards protecting indigenous lands is the activists in Honduras. So this, again, was super shocking to me, and I actually told a bunch of people about this after I learned about it because it was just so shocking that reporters, activists in Honduras were getting killed by actual people from the government because they were trying to stop the damaging of indigenous lands, or just damaging of their lands in general, but specifically indigenous lands. So I just found it really crazy that people actually part of the government or close to the government were actually completing these acts just to get these heads of activists down so that they could further their exploitation of the land. Something else I learned, and most of these activists were women, which is also very shocking to me because when you're learning about like Latin America, you hear a lot about machismo and how men are sort of always at the top, women are sort of always put to the bottom. But I found it really fascinating that these women were taking it in their own hands. Also learning about women, I learned about women exploited for their bodies in the Dominican Republic through sex tourism and effective extraction. So in the Dominican Republic, a lot of women are used to sell different like vacation packages, and the men, foreign men who buy these packages, or foreign families or anything, the men who buy these packages, they will go to that country with the hopes of getting with one of these women. A lot of the women do actually take part in this so that they can get money. They don't necessarily have to sell their bodies, they can also just be in relationships, but I found it interesting that the country sort of like um, almost advertises this. They do advertise it. They're like on their vacation packages, and the country is getting money from this because the more that women are advertised for these vacation packages, the more people buy them. So I found it interesting that the country is actually making a lot of money off of sex tourism. And then the problems, but all the problems that we see in Latin American countries also aren't present at everywhere, and that's something that I found in Anthony Bourdain's documentaries. They had less of a grim tone than the other articles you were reading that sort of made everything feel really sad and made the situation in Latin America really bad. But in Anthony Bourdain's documentary series, we saw that in Argentina, for example, there's a very high population of people going to psychiatrists, going to psychologists, and that was again really shocking to me. When Latin America is like machismo and it's all about like staying strong, you don't want to tell about your feelings, but this rise in psychology is really interesting to me. And then also in Uruguay, they're some of the most like progressive country in the world with a lot of abortion rights, and they legalized marijuana. So I think it's really amazing that we see the contrast between like places like Honduras that are killing activists versus Uruguay, who's one of the most progressive countries in the world. And also in Anthony Bourdain's documentary series, we're able to see how food really brings people together. And unlike a lot of countries in Europe, and especially the US, where people don't really get together for meals, you saw the really sense of community in those countries. So overall, this course taught me a lot about the different frontiers in Latin America. Like the Amazon is a frontier for trees and deforestation. The Andes were a frontier for minerals. Central America was a frontier for fruits and slave labor. And Mexico is a frontier for maquiladoras. The Dominican Republic is a frontier for sex tourism, and Latin America in general is a big frontier for resources. So I'm taking this course. I know so much more about Latin America than I did before, and I'm very, very happy that I now know more about the different types of exploitation that Latin America is going through, because now I will be able to apply that to my knowledge of every day and basically what's really going on in Latin America. I think this course did a really great job teaching me not only about the history that happened in Latin America earlier, but also about current events that are happening